The woman who raised me after my mother died looked me straight in the eye at my grandmother's funeral and said 4 words I will never forget. She left you nothing. She said it with a small smile, the kind people use when they're delivering news about rain on a Tuesday, something inconvenient but ultimately not their problem, standing in the parking lot of Street Michael's Episcopal Church in my black dress with my grandmother's rosary still warm in my hand. I felt something shift deep inside my chest. Not grief, something harder than grief, something that had been building for years without a name. Because my grandmother had told me something very different 6 months before she died. Let me go back to the beginning, because you need to understand what kind of family I came from before you can understand what I did about it. My name is Claire Whitmore. I'm 29 years old and I work as a pediatric nurse at a children's hospital in Columbus, Ohio. It's the kind of job that people call a calling rather than a career, which is a polite way of saying it doesn't pay as well as it should. I've been there for 6 years. I'm good at it. I know how to stay calm when everything around me is falling apart, which, as it turns out, is a skill that runs in my family, just not in the way I always assumed. I grew up in a house that wasn't mine. After my mother passed away from ovarian cancer when I was 21, I moved back to Columbus from nursing school in Cincinnati to help my grandmother with my grandfather, who had already started slipping into the fog of early dementia. My aunt, my mother's older sister, was technically the one with power of attorney. She handled the finances. She made the decisions. She attended the meetings with doctors and attorneys and financial advisors, while I attended to the actual human beings in that house. I drove my grandfather to his appointments. I sat with my grandmother through her own health scares. I cooked Sunday dinners and stayed late on holidays and said yes every time someone needed something. My aunt had a daughter. My cousin, who was 2 years older than me and had built her life in Phoenix, far enough away that the word help arrived only as a text message and occasionally a flower arrangement addressed to my grandmother. My cousin was stylish and social and always seemed to be in the middle of something important. My aunt spoke of her with the particular warmth reserved for things you want other people to admire. She spoke of me the way people speak of useful appliances. Functional, reliable, not worth discussing at parties. I had learned not to mind. Or I had learned to tell myself I didn't mind, which is a different thing entirely. My grandmother passed in March. She had been declining for about 8 months, a slow and quiet retreat from the world that she handled with the same dignified composure she brought to everything. A week before she died, when I was sitting with her in the room that smelled of lavender and old books and something I can only describe as the particular sadness of leaving, she took my hand and held it for a long time without speaking. Then she said something that I have turned over in my mind every day since. She said, "Claire, I made sure of you. Whatever they tell you, remember I made sure of you." I thought she was confused. The hospice nurse had warned us she might have moments of disorientation. I squeezed her hand and told her not to worry. I told her everything was taken care of. She looked at me with an expression so clear and focused it almost frightened me. "Find the blue tin," she said, "the one with the birds on it. Don't let her know you're looking." I asked her who. She closed her eyes. She never opened them again to say. The funeral was a Thursday. My aunt handled every detail with the efficient grief of someone who has been waiting to be in charge. She selected the flowers, approved the readings, arranged the reception, and managed the guest list with the organizational rigor of a woman who had been planning this moment for years. My cousin flew in from Phoenix looking elegant in a structured black coat and spent most of the reception accepting condolences that should have been divided more evenly. My boyfriend of 2 years stood beside me through all of it. Daniel was a contractor, good-looking in a reliable, comfortable way, the kind of man who opens doors and knows how to shake hands firmly and gives everyone the impression of being trustworthy. He had met my grandmother twice and seemed genuinely sad. He kept his arm around my shoulders through the burial and told me he loved me in the car on the way home. It was in that parking lot, when almost everyone had already gone, that my aunt delivered her 4 words. She said them quietly, pleasantly, the way you might mention that the restaurant is out of the salmon. Then she walked to her car, opened the door, and drove away without looking back. I drove home in silence. Daniel talked about dinner. I stared at the road. That night I went back to my grandmother's house. I still had a key. My aunt hadn't changed the locks yet, or perhaps it hadn't occurred to her that there was a reason to. I told Daniel I needed to pick up some of my things, which was true enough. I went directly to my grandmother's bedroom, to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed where she kept linens and old photographs and the particular accumulation of a life well saved. The blue tin with the birds was at the very bottom, wrapped inside an embroidered pillowcase. I recognized it immediately. It had sat on my grandmother's dresser for my entire childhood. She kept buttons in it. At least, that's what she always said when anyone asked. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name on it, written in my grandmother's handwriting. Below, it was a folded document. And below that, a small key attached to a paper tag that read First Federal, Box 1147. I sat on the edge of my grandmother's bed in that quiet room that still smelled like her, and I read the letter. My grandmother had known for 3 years what my aunt was doing. She had discovered it gradually, the way you discover a leak in a ceiling, one small stain at a time. Money withdrawn from accounts she didn't recognize, documents she didn't remember signing. Her own husband's pension being redirected to an account she wasn't listed on. She had confronted my aunt once and been told she was confused, that she was remembering things wrong, that this was a symptom of getting older and she should let the people who understood finances handle things. My grandmother had been 73 years old and sharp as a tack, but she was also a woman who had been taught her whole life to defer. So she deferred, but she didn't stop watching. The document in the tin was a copy of a will, updated 14 months before she died, signed and witnessed. In it, my grandmother divided her estate as follows: the house and its contents to be split equally between my aunt and the estate of my mother, which in the absence of living heirs would pass directly to me. A savings account designated separately for my grandfather's ongoing care, to be administered by a neutral trustee, not my aunt. And a note directing me to the safety deposit box at First Federal, where the original of this document was held, along with additional paperwork. At the bottom of the letter, in handwriting that was slightly unsteady, the way her handwriting had been in her last year, my grandmother wrote, "I know I should have done more sooner. I know I let her take too much. But I made sure of the important things, sweetheart. I made sure of you." I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I drove home, put the tin in my closet behind my winter coats, and told Daniel I was going to bed early because I had a headache. I didn't sleep. The formal reading of the will was scheduled for 2 weeks later at the offices of my aunt's chosen attorney, a man I had never met named Gerald Pruitt, whose office was in a glass building downtown with expensive furniture and the specific atmosphere of a place where other people's money changes hands. My aunt had arranged it. My aunt had arranged everything. The will, Gerald Pruitt read from, left the house to my cousin, the savings accounts to my aunt for management of my grandfather's care, a small bequest to a church charity, a smaller one to me, a number that didn't cover 3 months of my grandfather's memory care facility, and was presented with the kind of performative generosity meant to signal that no one had been forgotten, just appropriately valued. My cousin thanked everyone in a voice that suggested she was accustomed to receiving things. My aunt watched me across the conference table with an expression I could not entirely read, not quite triumph, something more cautious than that, more like a woman waiting to find out if she needed to do anything else. I thanked Gerald Pruitt. I shook my aunt's hand. I told my cousin the flowers at the funeral had been lovely. Then I drove to First Federal Bank on Henderson Road and opened safety deposit box 1147 with the key from the blue tin. Inside was the original of my grandmother's updated will, notarized and witnessed by 2 people I didn't recognize, which I later found out were neighbors 2 streets over who my grandmother had invited to tea for precisely that purpose. There was also a folder of bank statements going back 4 years, another folder of account documents for my grandfather's pension and Social Security payments, and a handwritten log in my grandmother's careful script, 4 years of dates and amounts and account numbers and descriptions, the kind of documentation that an 80-year-old woman creates when she knows she's running out of time but wants to make sure someone eventually understands exactly what happened. I'm a nurse, not a lawyer or an accountant, but I can read a bank statement. And what I read over the next 3 hours, sitting in my car in the bank parking lot, was a clear and systematic theft. My aunt had redirected my grandfather's pension to a private account. She had withdrawn from my grandmother's savings repeatedly under the explanation of household expenses, then transferred those funds in smaller amounts to accounts connected to my cousin's name. She had, according to the will Gerald Pruitt had read, produced a document that was either forged or derived from an older draft that predated my grandmother's final wishes by over a year. The updated will in my hands bore a date and a notary seal that superseded Gerald Pruitt's version by 14 months. I went home and sat at my kitchen table for a very long time. I thought about my mother, who had died at 44, trusting that her family would be fair to the daughter she left behind. I thought about my grandmother, sitting alone in her bedroom at night, writing down numbers in a notebook, building a case she would never live to present herself. I thought about my grandfather in his memory care facility, spending down assets that were supposed to be protected while my aunt's account grew quietly in the background. The anger that moved through me that evening was not the hot, impulsive kind. It was cold and very clear, the way things look after a hard frost when the air goes still and you can see every detail of every branch. I did not call my aunt. I did not call a lawyer yet. I went back to work the next day and smiled at my patients and did my job and told exactly no one what I had found. Daniel noticed something was different. He asked twice if I was okay. I said I was still processing the loss. He nodded sympathetically. He had been checking his phone more than usual lately, which I noticed in the same quiet, peripheral way I noticed everything. As a habit of attention I had developed in hospital rooms, where small changes in a patient's breathing could mean something important. I found an estate attorney on my own, a woman named Priscilla Vance, who had been practicing probate law in Columbus for 30 years and came recommended by a colleague at the hospital whose family had dealt with a contested will the previous year. I made the appointment in my own name and told no one I was going. I brought the tin, the folders, the safety deposit box contents, and my grandmother's letter. Priscilla Vance read everything twice. Then she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, in a tone that was both professional and unmistakably serious, that I needed to understand the document in my hands superseded any previously executed will as long as it was properly notarized and witnessed, which it was, and that the estate, as distributed by Gerald Pruitt, had therefore been distributed incorrectly, whether through error or intent. She said the pension redirection was a separate matter that warranted its own conversation. She said the forged documents, if that's what they were, constituted fraud. Then she said something I will remember for the rest of my life. She said, "Your grandmother did the work, Claire. She documented everything. You just have to be willing to follow it through." I told her I was willing. What followed was 6 weeks of a performance I have never been more committed to in my life. I called my aunt and apologized for being quiet and withdrawn since the funeral. I said I was having a hard time with grief and had perhaps been unfair in my thinking. I said I understood that my grandmother had wanted things to be simple and that I respected her wishes. My aunt's voice warmed noticeably. She said she understood, that grief made people strange sometimes, that of course she hoped we could move forward. She invited me to Sunday dinner. I went. I helped set the table. I complimented the roast chicken. I asked my uncle gentle questions about the financial complexity of managing an estate of this size and said I was so grateful she had taken that burden on herself. She explained things to me in a patient, slightly condescending way that suggested she found my gratitude both expected and satisfying. I listened carefully to every word. I noted every inconsistency. Meanwhile, Priscilla Vance had filed a motion with the probate court to contest the will on the basis of a superseding document. The motion referenced the notarized will, the safety deposit box, and the witness statements from my grandmother's neighbors, both of whom confirmed signing the document 14 months before my grandmother's death, that their signatures and addresses matched the notarization, and that my grandmother had been entirely clear-minded and composed at the time. Daniel asked me once during this period whether I had thought any more about contesting the will. He framed it as concern, practical concern, that these things were expensive and emotionally draining, and that maybe I should think about whether it was worth it. He said my aunt was difficult, and that poking at this might damage the family relationships I had left. He said he worried about me, that he loved me, that he just wanted what was best for me. I asked him who had mentioned the word contesting to him, since I hadn't told him I was considering it. He paused for just a moment. Just a half second. Then he said I had mentioned it once, when I was upset after the reading, that he remembered clearly. I hadn't. I remembered my exact words that evening. I had said the whole thing felt wrong. That was all. I started paying closer attention. 3 days later, I borrowed a friend's phone to call Daniel while he was at work, from a number he wouldn't recognize. When he answered and I didn't speak, I could hear in the background clearly and unmistakably my aunt's voice. She was saying his name in the familiar tone of someone used to regular conversation. He said he'd call her back. He disconnected without ever knowing who had called. The investment. I hadn't seen it immediately because I hadn't been looking. Daniel had been asking my aunt for 2 years to co-sign a loan for a commercial property development project he wanted to pursue. My aunt had been stringing him along, and apparently, in exchange for keeping her informed about my intentions and my emotional state, she had promised to support the loan once the estate was settled in her favor. I put the engagement ring he had given me 3 months earlier in my jewelry box and said nothing. I mentioned to my aunt at our next Sunday dinner that I had been thinking about something she'd said at the funeral, about the will being clear, and that I'd decided she was right, that there was no point in making things complicated, that I just wanted to honor my grandmother's memory and move forward. She smiled at me across the pot roast with the particular satisfaction of a woman who believes she has won. She reached across the table and patted my hand. I smiled back. I had been learning from her for 29 years. 2 things happened on a Friday in May that I had arranged with Priscilla Vance and a certain degree of theatrical intent. The first was that the probate court ruled the updated will valid, which meant the original distribution of the estate was legally void. The second was that the Adult Protective Services fraud investigation that Priscilla had referred to the state attorney's office based on the pension redirection and the forged account documents produced a warrant for the examination of my aunt's financial records. I called my aunt that Friday morning. I told her I wanted to have a small gathering at my grandmother's house, just family, to go through some of Grandma's personal items before the estate was transferred. I said it would mean a lot to me. I said I needed closure. She agreed. She sounded almost gentle. She had been operating from the position of someone who has already won, which is a remarkably comfortable and entirely dangerous place to be. My cousin came from Phoenix because I had called her separately and told her there was something she needed to see. I had not told her what it was. I had told her only that it was important and that she should come as herself, not as her mother's representative, if she understood the difference. She paused on the phone for a long moment and then said she would book a flight. My grandfather's care coordinator, a kind and meticulous woman who had been worried for months about discrepancies in his billing account, attended at Priscilla's request. Priscilla herself was there. The attorney from the state attorney's office stood near the door. And Daniel was there because I had invited him specifically, casually, as though it were nothing. We gathered in my grandmother's living room, which still held the particular quality of a room that has recently lost the person who gave it meaning. The curtains were the same. The furniture hadn't moved. On the mantel was a framed photograph of my grandmother and grandfather at their 50th anniversary, and beside it, one of my mother as a young woman standing in a garden with a child on her hip. Me. I was about 2 years old in the photo. My grandmother had kept it there for 27 years. My aunt looked around the room with the expression of a woman taking inventory. I asked everyone to sit down. Then I explained, clearly and without any particular drama, what I had found in the blue tin with the birds on it. I described my grandmother's letter. I described the updated will. I described the safety deposit box and the folders of bank statements and the handwritten log that my grandmother had kept for 4 years because she knew what was happening and was not confused at all. I put copies of the key documents on the coffee table and asked anyone who wanted to look at them to do so. My aunt's face went through several configurations in the space of about 30 seconds. Dismissal, then alarm, then something that looked like calculation. She said the updated will was almost certainly not legitimate. She said my grandmother had not been in her right mind in her final years. She said I had been manipulated by an attorney who saw a paycheck in a grieving family's dispute. My cousin was looking at the bank statements. She had picked them up quietly while my aunt was talking and was reading them with an expression of growing stillness. The way a person looks when something they suspected but refused to fully form in their mind suddenly becomes concrete. I told my aunt that the will had already been validated by the probate court, that the ruling had come through that morning, that the estate as previously distributed was legally void. Then I told Daniel, quietly and directly, that I knew he had been in contact with my aunt throughout the past 6 weeks, that I knew about the cosign agreement, that I knew he had been reporting my emotional state and my intentions to a woman who was using that information to protect a fraudulent distribution of my grandmother's estate. I told him I had no interest in a long conversation about it. I took the ring from my pocket and set it on the arm of the chair beside him. He started to speak. I looked at him with the specific expression I have developed over 6 years of working with children in pain, the one that means I see you and I understand, but we are done discussing this now. He stopped speaking. The representatives from the attorney's office delivered their paperwork to my aunt at that point, which they had been waiting to do until the informal disclosure was complete. My aunt stood up and knocked a glass off the side table. She called me ungrateful. She said my mother would be ashamed of me. She said I had turned a family tragedy into a witch hunt because I was jealous of my cousin, had always been jealous of my cousin, had never been able to accept that some people simply contribute more than others. My cousin said, "Mom, stop." It was the first time I had ever heard her tell her mother to stop anything. My aunt turned to look at her as though she had just spoken in a foreign language. My cousin said it again, quietly, looking at the bank statements she was still holding. She said, "Just stop." My aunt was escorted out of the house by the attorney's representatives 40 minutes later. She was not arrested that day. The investigation would take several more months before charges were formally filed. But she left that room in a way that is difficult to describe, not in handcuffs, not in visible disgrace, but in the particular silence of a person who has just realized that the story they have been telling is over, and the one beginning now is not one they wrote. My cousin stayed. We sat in the living room after everyone else had gone, and the room had gone quiet, and the light had that late afternoon quality that makes everything look a little softer than it is. She said she had known something was wrong. She said she had noticed, for years, the imbalance, the way I worked, and she was thanked, the way I was present, and she was celebrated. She said she had told herself it was family, that families were just like that sometimes, that she didn't want to make trouble. She said she thought I would always just be there, doing what I did, and she had taken advantage of that without fully admitting it to herself. I didn't tell her it was fine. It wasn't fine. But I told her the truth, which was that I wasn't sure yet what we were to each other now that the roles we had been assigned no longer existed. I told her I thought we probably had to find that out slowly. She nodded. She looked tired in a way I hadn't seen on her before, the way people look when they stop performing. She said, "She loved you, you know, Grandma. She talked about you constantly. Every time I called, it was Claire this and Claire said that. I used to be a little jealous, actually." She paused. "I never told you that." I looked at the photograph on the mantel. My grandmother and grandfather at 50 years, my mother young in a garden. I said I hadn't known that. The legal process moved slowly, the way these things do. The updated will was formally entered into probate, which meant the house and a portion of the savings accounts passed to me instead of my cousin. Though my cousin was not considered a knowing participant in the fraud and retained her original bequest, the pension redirection produced a civil judgment. The total amount recovered, after legal fees and court costs, was not everything that had been taken. These things rarely are. But it was enough to establish my grandfather's care trust with a neutral administrator, which was what my grandmother had wanted, and enough to matter to me in real and practical ways. My aunt was charged with financial elder abuse, fraud, and forgery. Her attorney negotiated a settlement that kept her out of prison, but included restitution payments and 3 years of supervised probation. She did not apologize. I didn't expect her to. I bought a small house near the hospital with a yard that has a lot of light in the mornings and a kitchen with a window that looks out onto a maple tree. It is the first home that has been entirely mine, where everything in it was chosen by me and nothing was acquired by navigating someone else's moods. Daniel left without a long goodbye. I heard later he had found another investor for his project. I hope she read the cosign terms carefully. A few months after everything was settled, my cousin drove up from Phoenix for a weekend. We went through the rest of my grandmother's personal items together, the things that didn't appear in any legal document and weren't subject to any court ruling. old china wrapped in newspaper, a sewing box full of threads in colors that don't make anything anymore. And at the very bottom of the cedar chest, behind the place where the blue tin had been, a shoebox tied with kitchen twine that neither of us had opened. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some in envelopes and some just folded, addressed to my mother at an address I recognized as the house where she had lived before she got sick, and after that to me, at addresses I had lived in through my 20s, a college dorm, a series of apartments, my current place. None of them had been sent. My grandmother had written them, addressed them, and kept them. My cousin found a single unsealed envelope at the top of the stack with my name on it, no address, just Claire, as though it had been written with the intention of hand delivery someday. I opened it sitting on the floor of my grandmother's bedroom with my cousin cross-legged beside me. My grandmother's handwriting, the later version, slightly unsteady, but unmistakably hers. She wrote that she had not always said the things she should have said out loud. She wrote that she had watched me for years and had seen, more clearly than I knew, what kind of person I was becoming despite the particular difficulty of the family I had been navigating. She wrote that my mother would have been so proud. She wrote that she was proud, that she was sorry it had taken her so long to be brave enough to do something about what she knew. She wrote that she hoped I found a life that was genuinely mine, not one constructed around other people's comfort, not one defined by absence, but something full and chosen and real. At the very end, she had written, "You were always seen, my love, even when no one said so." I held that letter for a long time. My cousin didn't say anything. She put her hand over mine and sat with me in the quiet of that room until the light shifted and the maple tree outside the window turned gold in the afternoon sun. I kept the shoebox. I read every letter in it over the following months, slowly, one at a time, the way you eat something that nourishes you and you don't want to rush. Each one was a version of my grandmother that I hadn't known was available to me, candid and funny and occasionally impatient and deeply observant. A woman who had paid close attention to her life and to mine even when circumstances and her own silences prevented her from saying so directly. My grandfather is comfortable in his facility. I visit every Saturday. He doesn't always know who I am, but he always seems glad I'm there. We sit in the garden when the weather allows, and I tell him what's been happening, and he nods in a way that feels, somehow, like understanding. My cousin and I are still figuring out what we are. We text more than we used to. She came to Columbus for my birthday in November, and we ate dinner and talked until midnight and didn't discuss our mothers once. It was one of the better evenings I have had in recent memory. I am not currently looking for anyone to trust with something as significant as a future. I am not in a hurry. I have learned that I am better at waiting than I thought, at sitting with something carefully instead of moving quickly toward the nearest available resolution. I have learned that patience, which was always described to me as my most useful quality, is actually a kind of power when you're the one deciding what you're waiting for. Every morning I drink my coffee in the kitchen with the maple tree outside the window and the letter from my grandmother on the shelf above the counter, in its envelope, my name in her handwriting facing out into the room. Not because I need to read it again, though I do, sometimes, but because it is the first thing in any home I have ever lived in that was put there entirely on my own terms. And because she made sure of me. Whatever else happened, she made sure of me.